Good morning, I'm Matt Driskill, editor of Asian Aviation Magazine and AsianAviation.com. Today we are in conversation, again, with Conrad Clifford, the Regional Vice President for Asia Pacific at the International Air Transport Association. Conrad, welcome to In Conversation. Thanks for joining me again, and I promise that my audio is good this time.
Thanks very much, Matt. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you.
You actually were my first In Conversation interview back in April when the situation around the world was sort of hitting the first stages, international shutdown. Here we are in December. It's been, the word unprecedented is kind of overused, I think, to a certain degree, but I think it certainly applies here. It's been devastating for airlines, airports, everybody up and down the value chain, the travel value chain. Just kind of bring us up to date. Here we are in December. We're facing the end of the year. What's the situation globally for airlines and then specifically maybe in the Asia Pacific region?
Yeah, thanks very much, Matt. And it's amazing when you look back to April and when we were talking before and the changes that have happened since then. I mean, for example, Virgin Australia, it went into administration and very happily it's now come out of administration under new ownership. So that's good news. Korean Airlines and Asiana, who could possibly have predicted that those two carriers would, one would be acquired by the other, but consolidation. So it's a very different landscape to where we were back in April. And of course, unfortunately, with the exception of the vaccine, which is fantastic news, thank goodness, it's been a very, very bad year, the worst year in aviation history. $118 billion of losses for the industry across the world, $37 billion of losses here in Asia Pacific. And I mean, absolutely unprecedented. We were the first region to be hit, of course, because it originated in China, and then it spread around Asia Pacific fairly quickly. And of course, we've got some pretty conservative governments around our region. They shut down fairly quickly, and we've seen all sorts of different approaches to how to reopen or even whether to reopen. Countries like New Zealand saying that they'll keep their borders closed until there's a vaccine. Countries like Singapore really trying to get started a lot faster. But the overall sort of summary is that for our member airlines and for any airlines, in fact, it's been a dreadful year. There's a huge dependence on government assistance because all airlines have struggled. You know, we're down to less than, in most cases, less than 5% of passenger traffic comparing to last year. A few silver linings with cargo and with obviously the impact of the internet for cargo deliveries. Some silver linings with domestic markets that have bounced back particularly quickly. Of course, China, great example of that. But otherwise, it's just dreadful. And we're approaching year end with a lot of airlines desperately in need of cash to survive.
Yeah, I want to talk about that later, but it's interesting. I want to follow up what you talked about with Qantas or with Virgin Australia. They came out. Qantas is conserving cash. Everybody's trying to conserve cash, but there's also opportunities that people are taking advantage of, like Rex in Australia, which is very interesting. Yeah. They're buying and leasing planes. I think they just announced new routes for domestic travel within Australia. So amid all this chaos and everything, there people are seizing the opportunity to do some things.
Yeah, and Rex has been very, very interesting. So I think they start in March. I think it's 9 flights a day. Sydney, Melbourne, the big Australia domestic city pair. And there have been other airlines around the world, not too many though this time round, but certainly some seizing the opportunity to restart with cheaper aircraft, cheaper crews, and all the rest of it. So, but as I say, comparing to maybe previous recessions, we're not seeing the same level of restart. Because it's basically, for most airlines at the moment, it's day-to-day survival. And if you launch an airline right now, unless it's a cargo carrier, you can't generate incomes. Yeah. And indeed, if you're thinking about launching an international carrier, forget it, because there are no international flights, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's crazy. A little closer to home for you, IATA recently had its AGM. COVID-19 was top of the agenda.
Yeah.
And I have to give you guys kudos because you, not just the organization, but Alexandre Juniac, the outgoing Director General, I mean, you have been very vocal, very diligent in promoting the restart of travel and international travel, been very diligent in pointing out that testing, things like that, will help. And again, it seems difficult to convince the governments that this is the way to go with testing, with either the IATA Travel Pass, for example, or the Commons Project, Common Pass. Which I did an interview with Jennifer Ju Scott about that the other day.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
It was very interesting.
Yeah.
Has there been any real progress? I mean, in Singapore, we're supposed to open a travel bubble with Hong Kong, but Hong Kong saw a spike in cases.
Yes.
Governments just don't, how hard is it to get them on board to say, okay, with testing, it's going to be okay? How do you get them on board?
Well, it's been a tremendous challenge because this is a health issue. And what we've seen is that the decision makers have been health authorities. So normally in aviation, you're talking about the Ministry of Transport, you're talking about Director General of Civil Aviation, you might be talking about the Ministry of Finance. But in this instance, it's all been the Ministry of Health. And they have a very different view towards risk and risk tolerance. In our industry, we've always had a risk-based approach to both safety and security. We know it can't be 100%, but we've pushed as far as we can with mitigating measures towards that 100%. But I think in the health industry, the underlying assumption is that it will be 100%, even though that's not realistic. And so when you're talking to people in that part of the of activity, they have a completely different mindset. When we talk about a COVID vaccine that has 96% efficacy, they all say, bring it in tomorrow. When you tell them that testing has a 95% efficacy, they say, no, it has to be 100. So there's a very different mindset going on with public health authorities. So we've been doing a lot of work, and ICAO as well, through CAPSCA, to try to engage with health authorities to look for a process of mitigation rather than elimination. Don't go for zero. It's not actually realistic. Even with a vaccine, it's not realistic. So let's go as close as we can to zero through testing protocols. And that's really what IATA has been pushing for very hard with government on behalf of our member airlines.
Well, it's interesting you talk about the percentages, because I think Anthony Fauci, Dr. Fauci in the U.S. has become very famous, much to the chagrin of certain politicians. He was saying that a vaccine that was 70% effective or something like that, would be a game changer. And now we've seen it at like you said, at 95, 94% around that area. I want to go back to the Travel Pass and the Common Pass from the Commons Project. Are these one and the same thing? Are you working with the Commons Project? Are they working with you? What's going on with that?
Okay, so we're working with a number of airlines and governments around the world on pilots for the IATA Travel Pass, and in fact, one of the pilots is Singapore Hong Kong. So we're working very closely, of course, with Singapore Airlines, with Cathay Pacific, with the Hong Kong government and with the Singapore government, and all of the sort of various bodies within those governments, like immigration, like health. And what we're trying to do is to come up with an open platform that's modular, that anybody can use, and you can also pick the pieces that you want and use those, and maybe not use others. So we're not trying to come up with the solution that's the solution for everybody. We're trying to come up with something that people can kind of pick and choose what best works for them. We want to see standards, so we're very much trying to introduce standards that will work across multiple platforms. But this is not, we're not going into competition with the likes of Commons Pass or anybody else. The one thing that we have seen with some of the offerings that have been coming out for this kind of platform, they can be very, very expensive. So the IATA travel pass will be on a cost recovery basis, which will make it very significantly cheaper than possible commercial applications that are coming out. We have already a very good foundation in what we call thematic, which is pretty much the global database for visa information for airlines and governments. And we're using that knowledge and that platform to push into accreditation of health centers, and then a form of certification for actual test results. That's at one end. And then at the other end, we've been working on contactless travel apps to try to assist people to go through the airport. And in fact, before, we've been working on this for 2 years, and one of the launch customers was Hong Kong International Airport, funnily enough. So we've just kind of upped that and plugged it into this offering, so that not only can you get your certification, prove that you're negative, but you can also progress through the airport without or minimizing the number of times that you contact or you have touch points with people to reduce any chance of transmission. So that's what it is.
The biometrics, I mean, CETA's talked about this. A lot of other people have talked about this. Airlines are starting to implement that more, the contactless journey and things like that. And it reminds me of the Tom Cruise, Steven Spielberg movie. I forget the name of it, but where you're walking along and you get your iris scanned all the time. Minority Report. Yeah.
It's filmed in Washington.
Yeah. I mean, is it going to get to that point where we're going to see all these scanners around everywhere, and it scans your iris and you're automatically admitted or not admitted, depending on the case?
Yeah, and yes, we that's what we're aiming towards. We're aiming towards a situation where you don't have to carry pieces of paper, and you can be processed infinitely faster and infinitely more efficiently because it's an electronic process, and indeed it'll be more secure because it's you don't have as much chance of human intervention and human error. So yes, and it's been interesting, and actually it is one of the good things to come out of this situation, that everybody wants to see contactless because of course it reduces the risk of transmission. So actually it plays very much towards these sorts of recognition and tracking that don't need people, don't need paper. And so where in the past we've encountered a lot of opposition and roadblocks from government, from security people, all of that now is tending to sort of fade away in the interests of public health, which is very good news.
It's good news. I mean, I have my problems. I think I watched too many movies like 12 Monkeys with Bruce Willis and Contagion and yeah. all of those different movies. So I've got to quit watching movies or get with the program on biometrics.
One of the really important things is privacy. So one of the underlying principles in this is that everything is stored on your token on your phone, and you elect whether you want to share it with anybody and under what conditions or not. So in this way, we're not going to store the information, we're not going to keep the information. It's simply going to be available for you to use electronically to interface with government authorities as you see fit. And that's a very, very important point, and you're absolutely right to raise it, because of course in many particularly in North America and Europe, privacy is a very, very big deal. So that's part of the underlying principle of the design of this.
Let's go back and talk about money a little bit. IATA has been very strong in advocating for additional aid to airlines, yes. To the industry in general as well. You've teamed up with ACI World in a couple of instances to provide aid that doesn't include debt. We've seen airlines hitting the debt markets, probably more so in the U.S. than in Asia, I think. Yeah. At least according to one of the finance professors I talked to the other day. Yeah. How is that going? And are governments, are they more ready or less ready to offer non-debt aid? Or part of the problem with the global shutdown in aviation, it's not just aviation, but it's also the economy. You've got restaurants, yes. You've got yes. this.
Yeah.
So governments are kind of having to pick and choose, what do they do? For aviation, what's going on in that respect? on non-debt aid.
Yeah. Well, just talking about debt, I mean, in this region, we've had quite a few airlines raise debt, but they tend to be the larger airlines. So Japan, Australia, Singapore, they've all raised debt very sort of effectively in commercial markets. But the kind of run-of-the-mill smaller airlines haven't been able to do that. So they have been asking government to help. It very much depends on the government. Some governments recognize the value of aviation, others do not. Particularly countries where they rely on air cargo, they've realized very quickly that if they don't allow their airlines to survive, then they're going to lose an essential part of the cargo supply chain. So you'll have seen New Zealand, in particular, as an example, introducing aid for cargo operation. And it's pretty obvious why. But a number of countries have just sort of said, well, we're not really worried, and we've got too many other things to worry about. But as the problem has progressed, and as actually the chances of failure and bankruptcy have increased exponentially, governments are realizing, oh my goodness, we won't have an airline at the end of this. So in fact, we won't have any airlines. So we better do something about it. So we are seeing governments around the region now changing tack slightly and saying, okay, what do we need to do? But there are still governments that are sort of saying, no, we can't help in any way. India is a funny situation because they have said that they can't help in any way. But of course, indirectly, they're helping Air India in a huge way, and as they always have done. So whilst on the one hand they're saying they won't help anyone, they're still underpinning Air India in a big way. But generally speaking, there's a bigger understanding now that airlines are going to go out of business if governments don't step in with some direct finance.
Yeah, India is an interesting case. I mean, I love the country. I've been there many times. I've done a lot of business there, and it's one of those countries where you just have to embrace the chaos and if you're doing business there. I mean, it's very interesting. Let's go back and talk about cargo a little bit because that it's kind of funny to me listening to the what used to be the weekly IATA press conferences, and then now they've kind of shifted a little bit. But one day cargo's up, the next day cargo's down, then it's up again, then it's down again. Airlines are they're converting passenger planes into freightors, which sounds, if you're a Star Trek fan, it sounds very Romulan. But where they take out the economy class seats and they are putting in freight, the ability to carry freight. But there's only so much of that they can do. Two questions. One, what's the outlook for cargo? And two, is the world and Asia Pacific specifically, are they ready to carry the vaccines? Is there enough capacity to carry the vaccines? IATA actually, I think you mentioned something, it would take 3,000 or some odd number of 747s to carry them.
8,000 freighters.
Right. Can you talk about that a little bit as well?
Sure. So the outlook. So of course, historically, the bulk of cargo uplift has been in the belly cargo space for passenger aircraft. So you take out 90% of the passenger aircraft internationally, and you've taken out the majority of the freight capacity. So as a result, we're left with all freighter operation, which is insufficient to demand. We've seen yields more than double over this period for the capacity that's there. And you also create a market that says, actually, we could strip out the interior of a passenger aircraft, put in a not exactly a full cargo fit, but nevertheless something that can carry parcels safely and securely, and we're going to make money with it. So that's what we're seeing airlines doing. Whether that will last beyond the restart of passenger traffic and the reintroduction of belly capacity on passenger aircraft, I don't think so. But we've got probably 2 to 3 years before we've got enough passenger capacity coming in with spare cargo capacity for that to be an issue. So the sort of 2 to 3 year outlook for cargo operation is very good indeed. In terms of the vaccine, we have been working with COVAX, which is a sort of an international initiative from a number of countries, both on the vaccine side, but also on the logistics. And as you said, this is a huge logistical challenge. And we think it would probably take 12 to 18 months to be able to deliver enough doses of vaccine globally to achieve a sort of 40 to 50% global coverage. And we're putting together the standards to be able to do that, because of course vaccines have a unique. It's a bit like we have CEIV Pharma. It's a particular standard for the carriage of pharmaceuticals, and we're adapting that and specifying for vaccine. Cold chain's a big issue. The Pfizer vaccine, for example, minus 50 degrees C.
That's crazy.
So that means you need very chilled warehouses, chilled aircraft to be able to carry that. So we're working on all of that, and we will be able to do it, but it isn't going to be as quick as people would like. That's really what I would say. And this is why we're saying that if we're expecting vaccines to be, it's going to happen tomorrow, or even it's going to happen by June, no, it won't, because we can't get the vaccines to people quick enough. And so we've got to have some kind of interim solution, which is why we're pushing very hard for testing regimes and testing protocols.
Yeah, and again, I bring up my movie reference. I watched Contagion the other day for about the 10th time, and it's going to take, as you said, 12 to 18 months to do that.
Yeah,
and it is not going to happen overnight.
No.
I know your time is limited, and I don't want to take too much of your time. Let's move on to another question. The aviation industry and the environment, COVID-19 is kind of thrown into sharp relief. Calls for airlines to get more fuel-efficient aircraft. CORSIA changed, and so the standards changed a little bit. Do you see airlines moving toward the more? Is this a good chance for them to say, okay, we're going to scrap that airplane, we're going to get the new more fuel-efficient airplane, or are they trying to simply survive and not worry about buying new aircraft? Because there's been a lot of deferments, a lot of cancellations.
Sure.
Are they going to use what they've got, or are they going to opt for newer generation, more green airplanes?
Yeah. So to answer your question, it is survival at the moment, but nevertheless, there's a very strong eye to the future, and we all know how important sustainability is. And in fact, one of the resolutions at the AGM last week was about sustainability. And indeed, what the airlines were saying was that we can see that with the current technology, we're going to require some form of liquid fuel at least until 2050. And under CORSIA, which was the carbon offset reduction scheme, we had set a target to be at 50% of 2005 levels by 2050. The only way we're going to be able to meet that target, and we want to meet it, is by aviation fuel becoming sustainable, alternative fuels, synthetic fuels. We call it SAF. And the challenge with SAF is that we need enough of an infrastructure to be able to pump SAF into aircraft around the world, particularly on big international city pairs. There's been a lot of work introducing, prior to COVID, a lot of work going on in terms of setting up individual city pairs, but it's very obvious that we need investment and support from government on the taxation side to promote and incentivize SAF. And of course, people will say, well, let's just all go electric, and we're not arguing with that at all, but we're saying that in this, while we've got all the technology there, it's liquid fuel, we can't just leap to electric, and particularly for the longer haul. At the moment, there isn't an electric alternative. I mean, frankly, at the short haul, there isn't yet, but there will be. So we have to have something that works to make us meet that target by 2050, and it's alternative fuel. And that's why the whole AGM resolution was talking about let's see some real work to put the infrastructure in place.
Let me follow up on that just very quickly, because Airbus came out with some very nice artist renderings of hydrogen-powered planes and all of that.
Yeah.
And I asked Airbus the other day when I was interviewing the head of Asia Pacific for them how serious they were about this, because if I'm going to put up a program of hydrogen power, which is, arguably it's got great benefits. There's some drawbacks depending on how you produce the hydrogen and all of that, but you've got an entire industrial infrastructure that you've got to change.
Yes.
It's the airports, it's the production of the hydrogen, it's the airplanes, it's the engine manufacturers.
Yeah.
And they say, we're going to have someone flying by 2035. And I asked Mr. Stanley, I said, are you serious about that? He says, yes, we're serious. But, if I'm going to do that, I'm going to put together this huge industrial consortium, and I'm not just going to put out some nice renderings of potential hydrogen-powered airplanes. I mean, is the industry serious about hydrogen?
Yes, they are. And I think particularly because of the long-haul challenge. So electric will probably do short haul, but for the longer haul, certainly over the next 20 years, it'll be liquid fuels. But beyond that, what are we going to do? Hydrogen seems to be the right solution. So yes, we're very serious about it.
Let's go back and talk about timing. Again, I know your time's up. We're almost done. IATA had previously said pre-COVID-19 traffic levels not going to return before 2024. Now we're getting the first inklings of vaccines being available. Hopefully they all work and there's no problems with them. Any changes, does that change IATA's timeline at all with the vaccine possibilities? Or are we still looking at 2024 before we get back to real life, I guess?
Yeah, so we were saying domestically 2022 and then internationally 2024. No, it doesn't change, because when we made that sort of forecast, it was on the assumption that we would have vaccines out by the middle of next year. So and at the moment obviously it's happening a little bit quicker, but not really very significantly quicker. And there's an awful lot of detail in terms of how you implement and roll out the vaccines and all the rest of it. So no, so it remains the case, and we put it into the original assumption when we said 2024 that there would be a vaccine by the middle of next year, and it's pretty well turning out, hopefully a little bit faster than what we originally forecast.
Finally, Conrad, as always, I like to ask about bright spots in the industry, and I think you've mentioned a couple of them now, vaccine, different things like that. Is there any one particular area that's a bright spot that we can look forward to for aviation specifically?
Yeah, I think because this whole thing around travel passes and electronic ID will revolutionize the way that we travel, and it will have a huge impact on not only the way that we travel, but also facilities. So airport facilities can become more efficient and more effective. Before all this started, we had all of our airports in this region, with just a few exceptions, pretty well full, particularly at peak periods. I think with this level of electronic development and the ability to move people through facilities more efficiently, it should make airports more efficient in terms of use of space and those kind of things. There are challenges, because where are you going to conduct tests? Ideally, we want to do it off airport if we can. But nevertheless, the fact that you can move people through an airport facility more efficiently, more quickly, may actually provide us with the space to find testing as well, and thereby come up with a better, more efficient use of the scarce resources that we already have. So I think that's a positive. Otherwise, I think the other good thing from this is that certainly from a government point of view, they've realized that air cargo is a vital and essential part of the supply chain, which was not the case in the past. So that's been good. But I guess the only one that we need people to get their head around is the essential necessity for air travel for global connectivity. I think for some governments they still haven't quite got that impact yet, but they will.
Conrad Clifford, Regional Vice President for Asia Pacific at IATA. Thanks for joining me in conversation.
Thanks very much, Matt. Pleasure to be with you as always.